right, well, welcome to St. Thomas Episcopal Church for our fourth evening of classes. This on the 7 deadly sins. This particular night, we're dealing with greed. So get comfortable. I know before we even start, you're all going to be guilty of this one tonight. All right, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. God, as we begin this evening, we want to give you thanks for responding so graciously to our prayers always, and always also to the prayers that others pray. Thank you for the restored health that you've offered to Ken Faye's son. And thank you for the ways that you've been watching over Lee and Karen and nursing each of them back to health as well. May they continue to have lively ministries and mountain homes that honor you and bless their neighbors. And God, we can't deny it, seeing in ourselves these sins that have been around forever is not a pretty sight to look at. We try to justify our greed by pointing out, well, it's endemic to our way of life. But we know we're just making excuses. We know better. But we still can't seem to help ourselves at all. Will you help us? We want to be content, but we have to admit as well that we want to be content on our terms. Teach us to desire it on your terms, for your sake, and for ours. Amen. Well, if anybody wants to leave now, it's just going to get worse. One other thing is kind of an introductory matter before we just really get up and going. I passed out first night that we had our study the pamphlet for the self-examination booklet. Have any of you been doing that on even something of an irregular basis? And if so, I mean, I don't want to know any details, but is it working? Are you understanding what's going on? Is it helpful? Is it not helpful? Does anybody want to say anything?
I find it helpful. I'll read through it and I'll recognize that certain of the points beneath them I identify with more than some others.
Sure.
But yeah, there's a lot to identify with.
Yeah, there are sometimes it's like, oh, doggone it.
All of them.
Yeah. All right, good. So the rest of you can either nod your head, yeah, that's happening.
Just to sit quietly. Just take have a reason to sit quietly.
Yeah, for sure. Well, if you don't have one, there are some additional copies beside the book at the end of this table over here. Be sure to grab one and take it home with you. You can jump in, look at the videos online to see what we talked about for pride and envy, for instance, and then jump into that self-examination booklet as well. And I think there's probably enough to keep you busy for an entire week dealing with one particular sin. And even though you get through it fairly quickly, gosh, you can keep doing this week after week after week for the rest of your life, and it probably would continue to be helpful. Okay, and then the last matter is sort of an introduction issue. Do you remember the acronym? I know one person does, so I've got one person I can ask, but does anybody else remember what the acronym is that lets you get all of these 7 deadly sins? What do you say?
Peg
Peglags. Is that right, Brian?
That is correct.
Okay, so do the next thing. If peglags is what we want, what do they stand for?
Pride, envy, greed,
Oh, no, I can't write that fast.
lust,
Anger.
anger,
Gluttony.
and sloth.
We might be real tired of all the acronyms that FDR gave us, but boy, they're helpful, aren't they? Only one thing to remember, and that gives you the key to remembering 7. So for us old timers that have no short-term memories, it's a good thing. All right, deadly sin of greed tonight. Dante, you may remember from that very first week lesson, Dante divided these 7 deadly sins into perverted loves, excessive loves, and defective loves. In the first 2 weeks, we looked at sort of perverted loves. This is the first of the excessive loves that we get to look at. It's the excessive love, or it's an excessive sin too, regarding greed. Now there's a bunch of synonyms that we could use to define greed. Avarice would be a good one there, but that's really just the Latin term transliterated into English. So covetousness might be one of the best terms we could use to define, or at least provide a synonym for greed. The Greek and Latin terms, and I'll mention them a bit later in our study tonight, the Greek term really means having more, whereas the Latin term talks about desiring more. And for most of us, that term greed really is desiring more than necessarily just having more. But I'm going to be insisting on this having more side of it tonight, because that will open up ways where we realize how doggone greedy we really are. All of our possessions that we have held on to. So that's not what I want you to see. I want you to see that. Greed is an excessive love for possessions, often of a material sort, but not only material things. You can always crave things that are not material. You can crave status, for instance, as well as other things. But anything that you're craving, it usually involves holding on to it. And so it often is involving arms, and it's involving hands in various ways. Some of these other sins, it's got different body parts that we insist on. But this particular one, it's arms and it's hands. So this girl, you can see those arms, holding, possessing. But usually, if we're honest, it's more like this. There's a sense of you stay away, it's mine. But even the dog's hands and arms are involved in this, aren't they? Dante, in his Inferno, he has the punishment that folks in hell who are greedy have to go through. They're pushing money bags at other people in swamps. So you can imagine pushing a big money, you'll never get it done. That's the punishment. In purgatory, they're not pushing around money bags, but rather they're laying in the dirt face down. You think, well, that's not much punishment. Well, for a person who's always had his eyes up like this, looking for something else to get, to now be forced to have your face down in the dirt, unable to see anything that you might want, is an incredible punishment for the greedy person to have to go through. But at any rate, the person who is greedy is constantly craving. It's an intense desire to possess something other than, something more than you already have. To extend the arms around it, to hold on to it. And that's an interesting image to start with tonight. To grasp or to hold on to possess. Because what did Paul say about Jesus in Philippians 2:6? Well, I don't know.
He let go of everything. He let go of
Jesus,
all the
who is
honors.
in very nature equal to God, did not think it anything wrong to hold, to grasp. He didn't want to grasp and hold on to his equality with God. And yet that's precisely what we want to do with our possessions. What Jesus doesn't do with his very godness, we want to do with our stuff. There couldn't be any better image to show how, apart from God, greed is. It makes us unchristlike, always holding on, grabbing on to. Hands are involved, usually for money purposes. You see it now, Steve? Tight-fisted, grabbing, clutching, laying hands on, snatching, grasping. Here's our Kansas State greed map again. What they've done this time is they've compared average per capita income to people living at the poverty line or below. Well, obviously that's not an issue in West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky or in the Ozarks, but if you're in Los Angeles or Florida or Seattle, that's a bit of an issue. There's probably other ways to come at greed, so we're going to keep going tonight. By the time we're done, the entire map is going to be bright red. Penny pinching might be another term we could use for greedy people. But however you look at it, possessions are holdings, tightly held. Isn't it curious how someone else's greed we think of as an obvious addiction, but our own forms of that, whether it be stocks or bonds or cash or land or books or cellos or whatever it may be, those make perfect sense. They're not addictions at all. They're perfectly sensible. But there you go. They're addictions all the same. All right, let's go back to Greek and Roman literature to start off with tonight. Greed is the desire for more. You fill in what more is going to consist of. Could be possessions, could be power, could be status, could be sex, could be people, you name it. We want more. We want more and we want more. Fifteen years ago, the church that I was at, there was a lady in that church who collected Precious Moments figurines. She had now, I assume she's probably continued to collect them. She had every Precious Moment figurine that had ever come out. So she had these glass cases around her living room and in her dining room, where she proudly displayed all of her Precious Moments figurines. Now, I, on the other hand, in my glass cases, I had John Wesley statuary that made perfect sense. But nobody liked to look at them either. I mean, the only person who ever looked at them was me. So Patty finally made me get rid of most of them. The ones I didn't get rid of are in boxes out in the garage right now. But if you'd like to look at it. Well, there's your ouch to get us going again. If you look at greed with more of a positive viewpoint, the interaction that it does with history at large is what makes history happen. Because, you know, if you want something, you have ambition and you go after it, whether it's as an individual or as a nation going after something. However, there's another way to look at that. Always turn to Karl Marx when you need a butt. But if you look at greed a bit more negatively, it always involves a bit of covetousness. It always involves, at some level or another, the defrauding person or extorting them, trying to get something from them that they don't necessarily want to part with. At least they don't want you to be the one who gets it. A couple of the old guys, Horace and Socrates, were pretty right about their understanding of greed. Does that ring true for you? If I just had, well, it doesn't work that way. We like to think that we know a whole lot more than those people way back then. It's amazing how well they understood human character. If you make the transition from classical literature over into the Old Testament itself, there's still this sense of wanting more, but the Old Testament focuses more on the dishonesty that is involved in much of what we seek to gain, the way we obtain it from other people. And so, for the most part, and these are just the smallest handful of places in the Old Testament. I mean, this list could be expanded almost indefinitely. But over and over and over again, the description is such that there's violence often involved in the obtaining from somebody else what you want from them. But always, it's at some level, there's a level of dishonesty in which you engage as well. And it's not just the powerful who are extorting or defrauding others. It can happen on the level where we are as well. So if you start even with the Ten Commandments, the Exodus 20 passage, there it's don't covet, don't be greedy, don't desire what somebody else has for yourself. Taking what rightfully belongs, or at least should belong, to someone else. First church that I was at after being ordained, one of the old guys in that church, when I would go through the potluck lines, he would often say, "Need some sideboards on those plates?" And it took me a few months before it finally sunk in my head what he was telling me. But from that point on, I didn't put as much food on my plate as I did those first several months. You know, this is what employers do to employees. They take what rightfully belongs to them, so that profit margin. Employees take it from employers, pens or paper or whatever. We do it to our descendants, our children and grandchildren, using up natural resources instead of just using them up, so that they shall not have what we have enjoyed. We're taking from them something that is not ours, but by golly, we don't care that they're not going to have it. We're going to have ours anyway because we want it to be warm or cold or whatever. The Jeremiah passage talks about a fixation of the eyes as well as the heart on dishonest gain by oppressing other people, by extorting other people. The same could be said in the Ezekiel passage. Are any of you familiar with Ambrose Bierce, other than in his occurrence at Owl Creek? He's got a wonderful little book called A Devil's Dictionary. And these are the kinds of definitions that it will have in it. They're just wonderful. So if you ever have a talk that you have to give somewhere, get a copy of Ambrose Bierce's Devil's Dictionary, and it will delight you. You'll have something you can use in whatever it is you're talking about. we don't give to others true value for what it is we take from them. And whatever it is the other has, we desire so much that we will simply take it. Hopefully we're not this crass, but, you know, it happens. We'll stop at nothing to obtain what it is we really desire. Are any of you Fyodor Dostoevsky fans? Have you read any of his things like Crime and Punishment? One of the characters in Crime and Punishment, one of the main characters is a guy by the name of Raskolnikov. And he believes that he can live above and beyond the laws that exist for everyone else. God's laws, I don't need them. I'm above that. They don't apply to me. And so he commits a crime in front of this. He kills a lady to show that he can get away with it. It isn't going to bother him. And so the rest of the 700 pages of Dostoevsky's book is how it eats at it, and eats at it, and eats at it. And his point is that you can't live above the law. You can't treat people that way. It comes back on you over time. Here's Hieronymus Bosch's eyeball with little pieces of the 7 deadly sins, and this is the one on greed. That's a judge sitting on his bench, listening to the person telling why he needs to have a judgment in his favor. But notice while the judge is listening to the guy, his hand is out, receiving a bribe from the other person. Coins are being exchanged. So there's not much chance of true justice happening in this particular instance, because the guy over on the right wants to maintain his greed. I knew I liked that guy for some reason. When you make the switch over into the New Testament, there's really not anything terribly new that takes place. It continues to be a look at the unjust ways that the greedy person obtains material gain from other persons. Usually it's the other person's expense. They really needed or should have what was taken from them. Usually when we think about the New Testament, what probably initially comes to mind is something like this. That the love of money is the root of all evil. But that only really scratches the surface of things in the New Testament. It really does just jump right in and follow along with what was said in the Old Testament about greed. So for instance, in Luke 12:15, that's right on the front end of where Jesus is getting ready to tell his parable of the rich fool, the guy who tore down his barns to be able to bigger barns to stash all of his possessions in it. That attempt to somehow obtain security by having more tends to backfire, because then you have to take care of all those possessions. And those possessions can never, even if you do take care of them, they can't ever be God to you. You've created an idol that doesn't work. And so in many places throughout the rest of the New Testament, usually in lists of other vices, greed will often be included as a mark of a life that doesn't really have God at the center. And well, a greedy person doesn't have God at the center of their life. They have things at the center of their life. So there's a lack of knowledge, a lack of true godly desire in people. And since they find fulfillment just in themselves, it really turns into a form of idolatry, with me being God. It all has to be for me. And then you begin having an issue where you confuse needs and wants. And I'll talk about that in just a second. And if you don't know, Dostoevsky didn't live last year. He lived 140 years ago. This was in the 19th century. Well, switching over to now Christian theology, greed is wanting things that we don't need. It's just the simplest way to put it. Greed is wanting things that we don't really need. Instead of being satisfied with God's providential care of us, giving us the things that we need, we want more. So here's this huge confusion in between wants and needs that we have to deal with. And I guess the place where I'd start is to just remember that much that we think we need didn't even exist a few years ago. And if that's the case, how could you possibly need it? If it didn't even exist when we were younger. And to push that just a bit further, some of you have probably heard me say from time to time that we live today far better than 99% of all the kings and queens and royalty across the entire world have ever lived. No king or queen even 50 years ago, or much less 100 years ago, or 300 years ago, would have ever thought that they could even dream of having the things that we take for granted and think we have to have. Starting with things like having washing machines that give us clean clothes just like that, or fresh food 12 months a year that stays refrigerated and nice and cool, or frozen so we can just go and get it whenever we want, or have cars that can transport us from here to there in no time, lickety split, or be able to converse or have messages sent across our kingdom that don't take weeks or months to get there and back. It can happen just instantaneously like we have today. We live so much better than people who were the most exalted in their time period even dreamed of being able to have, and still we think we need more than what we have. How can we need these things? Part of it, of course, is that we tend to be manipulated by ad agencies and peer pressure. But, part of it we just have to realize it's just our sinfulness. It is our greed. It's that we want what we do not need. I don't want to lay it all on ad agencies because it is a sin after all. If we could blame it on ad agencies, we could get away with it. But here's the thing, unlike gluttony, which, it can be sated. I mean, you can eventually get full and not want anymore. And unlike lust that, you eventually kind of grow weary of it, bored with it. Greed is insatiable. If you give greed a little bit, it just wants more. If it gets what it wants more. It's like it activates the switch. And once activated, you can't turn it off. It just keeps wanting. And it gets, in the intensity level, ramps up consistently. That's another way to say the same thing. God has given us all that we need. We recognize that in our prayers and our liturgies, that God gives us what we need. It's in our scripture text. Exodus. God gives the Hebrew people, as they're traveling through the wilderness, He gives them manna. He gives them water. But that's not enough for them. They want more than what they have received. They want wants to be satisfied. They want their artificially created wants to be satisfied. But God doesn't finally do that for most of us, most of the time. God satisfies our needs, not our artificially created wants. Probably most of us would be politically aligned, or at least feel good about this person. But even if you're not politically aligned, this is a wonderful quote. You have to kind of stare at it just a little bit. And if you're having trouble reading it, I'll read it for you.
Yeah, why don't you read it?
There's nobody in this country who got rich on their own. Nobody. You built a factory out there, good for you. But you moved your goods to market on roads the rest of us paid for. You hired workers that the rest of us paid to educate. You were safe in your factory because of police forces and fire forces that the rest of us paid for. You built a factory and it turned into something terrific. God bless. Keep a hunk of it. But part of the underlying social contract is you take a hunk of that and pay forward for the next kid who comes along. Elizabeth Warren. I just think that's a wonderful comment. I don't always agree with what she says, but she's spot on right there. Well, greed is often wanting to be independent of God. We want those things that we possess, or that we want to be able to possess, to end up replacing God's security, God's blessings upon us. We just want to be self-sufficient. But you know, greed is kind of like a barnacle. Greed is like a tick, or it needs a host. It needs something to keep scavenging at. You get rid of that, and greed can't exist. But still, we want things to finally replace God. Now, there's really a couple of ways to think about greed. Most of us, when we think about greed, we just think about hoarding. This piece of greed. But prodigal giving is really just as greedy. So I'm going to try to make that point here in just a moment. But first, the hoarding aspect of it. Scrooge Duck, the old miser, hoarding everything that he has, and then enjoying it, or at least hoping to enjoy it. Isn't it interesting that a fortune refers to a lot of money, at the same time that fortune means an act of chance? An act of chance that is given to you by the goddess Fate, who does that before you ever come along, not because of something you did, but because of something she wanted. That's fortune that we sometimes want to enjoy, thinking we can obtain it. You can't. You just get lucky along the way. Well, here's this sins to which greed gives birth. There's two ways to think about greed. You can be actively greedy, you can be passively greedy. If you're actively greedy, then you're either prodigal in the way that you give, or you hoard. And if you're passively greedy, same way. You can do it prodigally giving, you can do it by hoarding. And then the far side, those are some of the final forms that each of those things take. If you're actively greedy and you're just constantly giving, well, one of the ways you do that in which you're just sort of wasting money is gambling. Hoarding, you start looking at things like war or slavery, where you're obtaining something from somebody else. What they possess, you want. And so you go to war to obtain it. Or you enslave that other person to be able to obtain the things that you want. And then the passive form is down at the bottom there. Just laugh as much when you get what it is you want the next time. Okay, those forms of hard hearts and thievery and charity. Let me take just a moment to talk about each of those. If we spend all of our time seeking to get what it is we don't yet have, that ends up leaving very little time for us to do things that really matter, like care for other people, or engage in the work of the church on behalf of God with others, care for our neighbors, or whatever. How many hours per week, don't put up your hands and tell me, but how many hours per week do we talk to other people about the purchases that we've recently made? Or how many hours do we spend leafing through catalogs that we get in the mail? Or milling around stores looking for something it is that we didn't even know we wanted, but we're looking for something that we might want. We add up all that time. What if we use that time to actually accomplish something good? That's why I say that's a hard-hearted aspect of greed, where it's all about me and my wants, as opposed to me being able to do those things that I could do for others. And never mind the fact that if you're doing all of that, working a second job to be able to have better this or better that, then you don't have the time to be able to give to other people, even to sit and have conversations with them. And even if we split out all of the stuff about money, just the time itself becomes an issue. When we spend all that time that we could have spent in another way on somebody else's behalf. Well, here's Peter Bruegel again, the lady in the middle that we've seen in each one of these. This time she's got a lap full of money that she's counting. And if you look closely, there's just money everywhere. Some people are trying to obtain it from others. Some are gambling, shooting up at things in the sky. Others are stripping other people from it. But everywhere, people are counting money. It's Bruegel's version of greed. Thievery was the second version of this. Hard hearts, and then there was thievery. There are lots of early Christians who talk about thieves are people who have full closets, by which they usually would mean 2 sets of clothes. The first house that I owned in Nashville, there was only one bedroom that had a closet, and that closet was about this big. Now I realize that they had chiffons that they had as furniture in their rooms, but they just didn't have stuff like we have today. Here was one early Christian that he said, at one of the churches that I served in Nashville, we would, for about 6 months of the year, during the winter months, there was a program that cared for homeless persons. And the way that they were cared for, among other things, churches would come together and get several of the men and women and children, depending upon the era that we were looking at here, and bring them back to a church that you were a part of, feed them, give them a place to spend the night, shower if you had those facilities, etc., give them food the next day, those sorts of things. One gentleman on one of those occasions, and we participated in that program, so every week for about 6 months of the year, our church would be full of homeless folks, even though we weren't in Nashville. We'd bring them out. They loved to come to where we were because it was out in the country. They could get away from downtown suburbia or Urbania. But anyway, one of the guys on one evening asked me if I had an extra pair of pants that I could let him have. He was about my size, and I said, sure, let me run home and get them. So I ran home to get a pair of pants to bring back to him. There weren't any in the closet, so I got in my dresser drawer, and all I had was, in my dresser drawer, the only pair I had was my Sunday clothes. The only other pair of pants I had on were the ones I had on. I didn't have the other pants to be able to share with him. I had to go back laughingly and tell him, I have to give you the pants I'm wearing. I don't think he'd believe me, but that was the case. Now, I'm not nearly as good today. I have lots of pants, but on that one occasion, I owned 2 pairs of pants. I did okay for that few months period in time. Well, here's that chart again.
Are you going to talk about spoiling children?
Well, I will.
I can talk about this.
Okay, well.
Because I am frankly horrified by the electronics that my grandchildren have.
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah. It's part, I had to laugh on Sunday when Benita introduced something that she said you may not want to hear this, but, and I was laughing thinking, I have said the same thing for a long time. But, yeah, we make them into idols. We give them anything they want. We don't stop. We don't just give them what they need. We give them what they want. We give them way more than what they want. And so we then form them in our image. Greedy boogers that we are, we turn them into greedy boogers, as opposed to forming them in the nature of God. And it's rampant what we do with our kids, because we idolize them. And it's totally inappropriate. Doesn't mean you can't love them. Obviously you want to love them. But giving them everything doesn't help matters at all. Is that enough said?
That'll work.
Yeah, we could get into lots of specifics, but
how was it passive?
because you're not really getting anything from them except for their love. What you're hoping to get from them is their love to you, but you're not. It's something that you're giving more than it is taking. So that's why.
I'm trying to understand that if it's a form of greed in the giving part.
Well, greed takes not only the hoarding aspect of things, but the prodigality. You're wasting.
Prodigality.
You're giving way too much. You're wasting what it is that you're giving. The active form of that is gambling. passive form is like the way we treat our kids and grandkids. I'm gonna have some talking to do when I get home, so pray for me. So here's some forms that greed takes. Delusion and distortion, as well as waste. We tend to think that we're better people the more we have. If I have a better car, I'm a better person. If I have a better home, I'm a better person. If I live in a better neighborhood, if kids go to a better school, I'm somehow, if I go to a better school, I'm a better person. And that doesn't have anything to do with it, because it has to do with our relationship with God that might make us a better person. One of the interesting changes that has happened over the last 40 years, when I was getting ready to go to college, if you wanted to get a better job, you didn't go to college, you went to trade school to get a job that paid. Going to college was something that you did to get a liberal education. Liberal, not in the sense of liberal versus conservative, political speaking, but liberal in the sense of great books, expanding your mind, your horizons. But even college today, colleges sell themselves on their ability to help you get a better job. Colleges have become trade schools of yesterday. Where do you form character? Now, one could argue that you never formed a character in college anyway. That occurs in church. But insofar as college was that liberalizing aspect of life, you could form character there. You learned about things that you did not know otherwise. Where does that happen today? Even callings, the calling of being clergy, is often shifted over into a career. Well, something happens to a calling when it becomes a career. It becomes something that you climb the rungs of the ladder to get to a better one, thinking that if I'm at a better church or whatever, then I'm somehow a better person. And it becomes problematic. And waste was the other aspect I put up there. Do you realize that 14% of all of the fish that are caught in the world each year are made into cat food? Just for North American cats? 14% of all the fish feed our cats. We spend 45 billion, we, meaning Americans, spend $45 billion a year on pet food. $45 billion on our overweight pets. Now, you know, I have dogs. I like them to be fed, but $45 billion? And if you add in then all the other things that go into having pets, I don't, but we spend $2 billion a year on Valentine's Day gifts for our pets. I'm going to buy Valentine's gifts for Patty. I'm going to buy them for... We spend $110 billion a year, just Americans, $110 billion a year on our pets.
For every penny.
Do you realize what else comes to $110 billion in a year? That's the budget of SNAP, food stamps. We spend as much on pets as the American government spends on SNAP in a year. I know they're still working, but imagine if the priorities were maybe a little better off. Some people might be able to eat a little better. Well, okay. Flared nostrils is one way to look at, or at least looking down your nose, your nostrils is a way to think about pride. Envy, it's those leering eyes, this kind of thing, looking at somebody else. But definitely when you turn to greed, it's those grasping hands that you have to deal with. So what are the remedies? Well, learning to give appropriately. And I think self-giving might be the right terminology here. It's not so much giving stuff as it's giving self. If we can learn to give ourselves appropriately, we can get rid of a lot of our greed. Because giving ourselves is often what we don't want to do. If some homeless person comes up to me, I might give them $20, here, go. I don't want to give them me. I give them $20 to get them on their way. We become human only as we give ourselves to others. And the only way you're ever going to really know that is you got to commit yourself to it. If you're not willing to commit yourself to giving yourself away, you'll never know whether that's really true or not. So the best greed detector is seeking comfort and happiness in things. If that's where you're finding your happiness, then you've probably got a problem. Mother Teresa once said that you'll never know that Jesus is the only thing you need until he's the only thing you got. Which of course means most of us will never know whether that's true. Well, James has made it back, so and you do have a computer, I see.
Yeah, I didn't forget it twice. I would worry if I came all the way back here and forgot what I went there for.
Yeah, I think that's one.
It's actually ironic. I was part of what I was going to talk about on one piece of this was not rushing. We've entered into Lent, and it's like I get here in plenty of time, then I open it and I'm like, I don't have my laptop. So that's why you saw me frantically want to run in here and say, well, I could either shoot from the hip with the notes and allude to a PowerPoint, or I could run back and get it. So made it in perfect time. And hopefully you guys have at least been coming back to kind of a nominal understanding of the sins versus the virtues. We've been trying to, you like my Photoshop, trying to kind of take you guys through it like like Pitt and Morgan Freeman the best we could. No quiz this week, but next week be ready. It'll probably be just mainly naming what the virtues are. The sins are a little easier to remember. Virtues, especially when they change them back and forth, make it a little bit trickier. So today we continue on our series, and we're at justice. And as the virtues go, justice isn't the most popular, I found out. We would much rather hear about mercy or pardon, at least in regard to ourselves, and yet justice is one of the most important virtues a person can possess. There's no such thing as holiness or righteousness without justice. So, our favorite question, how many times? Now this one's a little bit tricky because there's some words that are close to justice, so they'll give you a little bit different count, but so I went with kind of the one in the middle, so we'll see if that hits it. How many times is justice mentioned in the Bible? What was it?
Old and New Testament?
Yep.
43.
Wow. Not 43, but 143.
Woo! Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. That's what I'm thinking.
So I think, yeah, just add one and you nailed it. So again, we often think of justice in legal terms, as in the justice system or someone being a justice of the peace. But justice is obviously not inherently just a matter of laws and rules. Rather, our laws exist to serve justice, or at least they should. And the justice system should serve to enforce just laws. And if you look at a biblical, there's a few different ones, but a biblical definition, justice is the moral virtue that consists in the constant and firm will to give their due to God and neighbor. Justice toward God is called the virtue of religion. Justice toward men disposes one to respect the rights of each and to establish in human relationships the harmony that promotes equity with regard to persons and to the common good. The just man, often mentioned in Scripture, is distinguished by habitual right thinking and the uprightness of his conduct toward his neighbor. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. So in a word, justice is giving God and neighbor what they're owed, while fortitude and temperance, which we'll talk about another week, are focused on self-control. Justice is critical because it governs how we relate to both God and neighbor. And I thought this was a pretty good slide. It just kind of mentions those 143. Even though it doesn't mention all the books of the Bible, it just puts a few in there as placeholders to kind of get your idea. But it's easy to see that, even though justice, you'll take a little bit of a different context because people a lot of times will falsely think the Old Testament is a harsh justice, but New Testament is loving justice. No, it's all the same justice. I mean, when Jesus clearly redefined, when he said, what laws should we keep? Whenever he mentions that, well, it says that if you commit adultery, it's a sin, but I say, you can look at a woman with lust, you've committed sin already. So it's definitely the same justice, even if it is in a different historical context. And you can see pretty easily here, you're getting into lots of the prophets. So there's going to be a lot of talk of justice. But once you get into the Gospels, you're still seeing a moderate amount. Oh, how did he get in there? When justice is done, it is a joy to the righteous, but terror to the evildoers. Proverbs 21. Amos, but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. But then you get to Romans. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Luke 11:42. But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb, and neglect justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. So again, a lot of times when we think of justice, we do think of law and order. And a few years ago, there was a dispute where Chuck Norris did sue NBC, the show Law and Order, because those were the names of his right and left leg. At least that's what they said. So again, justice can be law and order, and we'll mention on it very briefly. We won't go into it in a lot of detail, but Aquinas actually does say that there is some forms of rightful vengeance. But normally that's not what we mean in the modern context. Everybody know who that is? So the first extreme views justice in merely negative terms. As in punishing criminals who deserve it. We cheer when, what's his name? Dirty Harry. Not Plenty of Company. Same thing. When Dirty Harry deals out judgment to the criminals with the barrel of his Smith & Wesson .44 Magnum, the most powerful handgun in the world, he always reminds us. But while Christ coming to judge the earth with lightning in his eyes is one aspect of justice, it would be a mistake to think of justice only as dealing out punishment. Justice is a virtue and foremost a positive thing. In our relationship with God, we render him due in the form of love, service, and gratitude as our Creator, living justly toward God is to render him these things perfectly. And again, Romans 13:7 sums up the action well. Pay all of them their dues, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. When we respect law enforcement, pay our taxes, we are living justly. The other extreme is viewing justice as a vague and sentimental desire to help everyone. Again, this can be under the guise of social justice, and again, while social justice is a valid concept, when strictly and carefully defined, more often than not, it simply becomes an excuse for political violations of private property, dignity of charitable giving, etc. So again, it can definitely take a multitude of definitions, but we always have to be careful not to only look at kind of like our modern 2023 United States Midwest definition and apply that to all pieces of Scripture. So in Scripture, again, we are told to do justly and walk humbly with God, Micah 6:8. Justice isn't just negative, a matter of dealing out judgment, like we said, but also a positive thing, that we render whatever is owed to God and others. And even though I usually focus on Aquinas, I thought Augustine defined it very well when he described justice as the virtue that perfects the will. Unless all people are by nature equal before God, there is no natural requirement on humanity's part to be just. Justice regulates the voluntary action whereby one person is brought into contact with another. Justice is divided into distributive, commutative, and legal justice. And he goes on to kind of describe this as, even though prudence, which is one that that virtue Vaughn may be telling you about in a couple of weeks. I think that's the week I'm out. But prudence tells us the right thing to do in a particular circumstance. Prudence gives us the truth. God shows us the way and we act. But justice is doing that right thing. So you can kind of see how everything is interlocked. The Latin word justus, J-U-S-T-U-S, is based upon the noun jus, or jus, I'll probably need to correct me on that pronunciation, which means that which is binding or obligatory. The law of Moses was binding upon all Jews. However, following God's law revealed through Moses was not meant to be a mindless act. Jews have always felt the law is a living, growing law that requires human discernment. Living justly means acting justly, knowing the right thing to do, prudence, means little if right action isn't done. Right actions are what justice is all about, and right action consists of more than just our dealings with God. Our dealings with God flow out to all of those who belong to God, so justice means acting rightly toward others as well. And again, this is the more modern movie, but within the movie, when we're talking about Ben-Hur, you see a big series of, Judah Ben-Hur is a Jew. It just has Jesus kind of in the background, and it kind of brings it together a little bit differently, as I already described. But he keeps describing how he, has done wrong. He needs justice. My family, they deserve justice for what's happened to them. But throughout the movie, he kind of starts out with justice and vengeance to kind of better understanding justice more as love. So again, justice does not equal revenge. And Martin Luther King Jr., it is not possible to be in favor of justice for some people and not to be in favor of justice for all people. And again, that could apply to the early mid-20th century, today, 200 years ago. So a lot of times we think immediately Black Lives Matter. It could be anything though. It could be 100 years ago, Native American Lives Matter. I mean, his words here, I think, sum it up very well. That it's not possible to be in favor of some justice, or favor of justice for some people, and not for all. And to an extent, Christian writers allied themselves with Plato and Aristotle, kind of as we described before, Aquinas also. But inadvertently, many were downplaying another central element in Christian thought and morality, the emphasis on agape love. This type of love, would seem to be a matter of motivationally active feeling rather than being rational, and some writers on morality eventually allowed this side of Christianity to have a major influence on what they had to say about virtue. Aquinas fleshed these virtues and related them to a much larger degree, and how that would relate back to justice. And again, in his writings, which we don't have tons of time to go into, again, thankfulness, friendliness, generosity, all of these Aquinas viewed as justice. But there's one that I want to kind of focus on tonight, just because I hadn't really thought about that as being justice. But it kind of made me do a double take, and that was he looked at religion as justice. One of the most interesting virtues that Aquinas understands to be related to justice is, again, something we don't really commonly think of, being religion. And Aquinas talks about it as a virtue, as a abiding tendency to give God the honor, worship, and thanksgiving we owe. It is the element of debt or obligation that relates it to justice. But religion is not simply a type of justice, since our debt to God can never be satisfied. How could we ever really give God adequate return for our creation, redemption in Christ, hope for eternal life, and all the countless blessings that God has showered upon us? It is nor merely just a matter of obligation that religion is the virtue by which we tend to give God what we owe. Aquinas is quick to point out. Devotion and prayer are interior acts of virtue that will lead to outward actions such as adoration, tithing, generous giving. But it's important to see that Aquinas is really imagining these religious acts, of course, that will be filled, empowered, and directed by grace, again, faith, hope, and love, into a deepening personal relationship, ultimate union with God. And this he will define as ultimate justice. So in the spiritual life, it's all too easy to reduce everything to feelings. Feeling God's presence, having good prayer experiences, feeling affirmed and uplifted by God. Often enough in our day, God is reduced to a doting grandfather figure. You hear people, the old man in the sky, and I'm like, who? But who just wants to spoil us with whatever we want, and like the spoiled kids we're talking about, and overlooks everything. In this context, it's easy to think that we can take or leave religious practices if they don't give us a good feeling, or if we don't feel like doing them. And in this context, Aquinas has to say very bluntly that the virtue of religion is in relation to justice, is not just useful and important, but it's also corrective in our relationship with God. God is not a divine accountant keeping track of our obligations. God doesn't need our religion. We need our religion. To be authentically human is to give a return to God for what God has done for us, not only in thought but in action. God deserves it, and we need it, and that is why Aquinas views religion as an element of justice, and I think he might just be right. And I probably won't show one every time, but this one I just thought it related pretty well to just kind of what we were talking about, and me having to rush like crazy to get back over here. And the one piece here, do we remember, particularly did the one picture. Oops, how's that not working? I probably should have done that when I messed it up. Oh, there it is. It's acting like it's another screen. Can't see it on my screen, that's why it's a little bit fumbly. And right here, again, he's been freed from the galley ships. I could use that as justice. He was adopted by the guy he saved. That could be justice. Again, watch the movie. He's so now determined to get back to Rome to get justice that he almost misses what's before him, and that was the person who last time we saw gave him water.
Judah! He is here. I have found him. The child has become a man, and the man, oh, I know it now, is the Son of God. The promise is true.
Happy Balthazar. Life has answered yours.
Life has been answered. God has answered it. Come with me.
When the Romans were marching me to the galleys, thirst had nearly killed me. A man gave me water to drink. I went on living. I should have done better if I poured it into the sand.
No.
I'm thirsty still.
Come, listen.
I've business with Rome.
You insist on death. Goodbye, Judah.
Picking up from last time when he was given water, what he referenced, but he's so determined to hurry to get back to Rome, he doesn't realize that was he gave him water, and they're kind of assuming this was the Sermon on the Mount. But too much of in a hurry. Hopefully this season we won't be in that big of a hurry. Bring my mouse back now. I'll get that figured out before next time, hopefully. There it is. Ah, perfect. Not too much disruption, hopefully. All right, and still going on with Mark Balma, who did the big fresco in University of St. Thomas. He also did one, obviously, on justice. And I thought the description here was pretty good. Traditionally, the virtue of justice is depicted as a blindfolded woman holding equally balanced scales. Justice is meant to be blind. It does not make judgment based on prejudice, and in Balma's interpretation, the scales become the main symbolism. With images of male and female figures balanced perfectly upon them, the figures are not blind, but they see themselves as they are in their natural state, different and unique, but equal in respect to one another, on a scale which is fixed. Behind them, in the dark form of a stylized eagle, wings outstretched in an upward lift, the shape of this mythical bird was inspired by the thunderbird of Native American folklore. Native people believed the eagle to be a mediator between heaven and earth, as it was able to soar effortlessly. It was considered the essence of spiritual enlightenment and principles to be upheld. This representation of the eagle was adopted by early American colonists and become the symbol of our country. The entire piece is framed by a circle, a symbol of perfection. And on October 20th, 1994, when they did that open house, 7 community members were invited to comment. One of them, the Honorary Rosalie Wall, retired Minnesota Supreme Court Justice, spoke specifically on this panel. Through the days and years, as our eyes are lifted to the frescoes of justice, to the outstretched wings and balanced scales, may we remember those principles to be upheld. May we remember that every person, poor or rich, black or red, or brown or white, male or female, has the right to equal justice under the law. May we work together to make justice a reality in our common life. And I think as we constantly hear justice, used in and out of context in the news, I think it is important just to kind of look back at this as really a virtue. And then everything kind of falls back in line, whether we're looking at it through Aquinas's lens, or in our own interpretation, or a modern interpretation like this one has, with the foundation built on God. And again, I still think, I know a lot of times it seems a little clunky where it's like, wait, Ben-Hur again? But as you kind of look at this, I think it kind of just helps as he keeps approaching closer and closer to basically Easter, Resurrection Sunday, kind of like we are with this study, and as we enter Lent, I think it's definitely important to reflect upon that. And with that, Vaughn, I'll let you take back on.
Well, all right, next week when we come back together, we're going to have lust on the first half and love on the second half. Should be a good thing. Thanks to Gina for fixing dinner tonight, and people who bake bread and desserts always. Come back next week. I guess I'm up for soup again next week, and then the following week, Chris will be making soup, so definitely want to be here for that one as well. Thanks, Gina. All right, thanks for coming, and we'll see you on Sunday.